Welcome to Haunted Talks, the official podcast of The Haunted Walk, offering ghost tours and paranormal adventures in Kingston, Ottawa, and Toronto, Ontario, and online experiences to anyone in this mortal realm. My name is Jim Dean, and it is my privilege to be your haunted host for this episode. Let's set our scene. The cold and dark days of winter 1992 are waning in Windsor, a southern Ontario city just across the river from the sprawling metropolis of Detroit, Michigan. An extended family gathers in a dark room, seated in a circle. The intimate meeting is presided over by a medium, a woman named Mrs. Noonan, and a reporter from the Toronto Star is present as a witness. The group is preparing to hold a séance, a communication exercise that is undertaken when people hope to contact spirits. In this case, it's a rather pesky entity plaguing the Crandall family's rented home. The Windsor and Detroit public have been gripped by the sensational story for over a week. Terrifying tales reported in the media about a prankster spirit who just won't leave the family alone, and a poor family at their wits' end. In true desperation for some reprieve, the Crandall family, haunted by their own personal dramas, turned to a medium for assistance. The group opens the séance with a chanting sequence, which is pretty standard fare for contacting spirits. As the group settles into silence, the medium, Mrs. Noonan, urges the ghost to show itself. Having received only a timid response at first, there is more chanting, intermingled with more urging, then more chanting. The process repeats a few times, seemingly ramping up to some kind of ghostly crescendo. Finally, after repeating the sequence over and over, the group manages to pull someone unseen from the shadows. It starts as a faint, flickering silver light coming from one of the bedrooms. A warm feeling envelops the group. Mrs. Noonan's glasses are knocked on the floor, and some papers are pushed around the room. As Mrs. Noonan is gradually overtaken by the spirit, it reveals its identity. "My name," responded a heavy voice, slowly and uncertainly. "My name is Leo." After some further questioning, the voice tells the group that it has passed into another life. It is confirmed that they are now talking to the dead. Everyone in the room was curious to learn why this Leo was causing them such angst. Eager to put the spirit to rest so that the living could also rest, they were intent on helping with any unresolved earthly issues bothering the spirit. After more coaxing from the group, Leo revealed that he had been wronged by a member of the Crandall family who, perhaps conveniently, wasn't present at the séance. Exactly what happened to cause this conflict was never disclosed by Leo, but the spirit made it clear that there was some unresolved rift that caused him to return after death. As the spirit faded away from the séance, he promised to leave the family alone and progress to the next life. The lights then came back on, and the medium came out of her trance. The assembled group had mixed reactions. Some family members were completely shaken in a troubling, nervous state that would take days for them to emerge from. Others were quite nonchalant and unbothered by the whole thing. The Toronto Star reporter took all of this down in neutral and detached detail, publishing it in newspapers across the country over the next few days. With the séance officially over, the ongoing family drama bubbled to the surface, and the attendees launched attacks against one another, arguing over who the spirit had identified as the wrongdoer. The rest of the incident played out like tantalizing family gossip, as insults were hurled back and forth. Although the details of the drama were intriguing, most readers were probably most interested in the spiritual questions. Was there something far more sinister going on here? Or had this séance stirred up some kind of trouble? The landlord of the affected home seemed to think so, and he huffed that the property would likely have to be deserted. It had caused him so much headache. As reported in the Star, the Crandall landlord appeared on the scene to express great wrath that his tenants should ruin the reputation of his property by permitting ghostly revels and to inform them that they must move. The salty landlord, who was so worried about his reputation in the community, wasn't alone. While some people openly embraced séances and other spiritualist practices, others tried to distance themselves from those kind of things. What was playing out in Windsor mirrored ongoing questions across the country that were further polarizing people every single day. On one side, a group who was determined to understand and make contact with the dead, and on the other, people who strongly cautioned against messing with spirits, most of whom were terrified of the repercussions. On our next 2 episodes, we'll explore the controversial rise of spiritualism in Canada and why this relatively small religious movement sent shockwaves across the nation. From fabricated séances, to enraged pastors, to members of high society claiming they could speak with the dead, to a new category in the Canadian census, early 20th century Canada is fraught with ideological tensions that mirror wider social upheaval. As people clamored for their own chance to contact the spirit world without the intervention of a traditional spiritual leader, rumors, falsehoods, curiosity, and alarm ran rife. As the divide between spiritualist practitioners and doubters widened, famous people waded into the controversial waters. At the end of this 2-part episode, you may be surprised by the household names who practiced spiritualism. Some openly, but many only in private. Most of Canada's intellectual class showed some interest in the practice. It was in style, after all, and one of the most popular recurring topics at dinner parties, salon gatherings, and public lectures. The question on everyone's mind was, can we actually contact the dead? And if so, why do they want to communicate with us? Are their intentions always good? Or is something far darker lurking in the shadows? But before we get to that, Happy New Year, everyone. I hope 2025 is off to a great start for you. We're excited to kick off the year, and it's already shaping up to be full of unexpected surprises, weird mysteries, and plenty of spooky shenanigans. We are currently hiring in all 3 cities, so if you've ever thought about becoming one of our storytellers, or know someone who would be perfect for the job, now is the time to apply. Spots are limited, and it only takes a few moments to apply at hauntedwalk.com/jobs. No resume, no cover letter needed. It's truly a fun, and unique job, and if you're interested, I hope you'll apply. With February here, some of our most popular experiences are waking from their winter hibernation, including the original haunted walks of Kingston and Ottawa, Ghosts of Queen's University in Kingston, and Spirits of the Distillery District in Toronto. Plus, Alone in the Dark returns to Cumberland Village in Ottawa on February 8th, running through to mid-May. So be sure to grab your tickets before then to save $13 per ticket. And if you're intrigued by this episode and spiritualism in general, you'll love Alone in the Dark, where we use spiritualist-inspired techniques like call and response methods, spirit communication experiments, and more. You can experience it at Cumberland Village throughout the season, or join us for a special Valentine's weekend offering at the Village at Black Creek in Toronto. It's the perfect way to treat your boo to a little boo. If you'd like to send us a Valentine, we'd be grateful if you left a review for the show wherever you listen, or recommend us to someone you know who would love the topics we explore. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and now Blue Sky, all at Haunted Walk. Thanks for listening, and let's get back to the episode. We begin our story with a very brief recap of spiritualism before turning our attention to Canada. In its simplest and most wide-ranging definition, spiritualism is often summarized as a diverse set of views where followers believe that individuals on Earth, whoever you are and wherever you came from, can communicate with the dead. With the right tools and method, anyone can reach out and receive a response. People around the world had been engaging with the core tenets and practices of spiritualism for millennia, using many different methods to reach out to what is often called the other side. Spiritualism can sound a bit far-fetched at times, even in our contemporary era, where we're exposed to diverse beliefs. But a closer examination reveals practices that we can see everywhere in our popular culture. For example, most of you are Haunted Talks listeners, and people who have attended our Haunted Walks tours are familiar with paranormal investigations and the different methods we use to try to contact spirits. Everything from call and response, to Ouija boards, to communication cards. At their core, most of these techniques are widely defined as spiritualist, that is, attempts to make contact with ghosts using different tools. Without knowing it, most of us have probably engaged in spiritual practices, at least informally. Have you ever walked around a creepy building and called out, "Are any ghosts here?" Or, "Knock once, if you can hear me"? Well, that activity falls into the widest category of spiritualism. Followers of the practice today often draw upon a very diverse and rich collection of beliefs and practices from many cultures, religions, and time periods. However, the spiritualism we are going to discuss is a bit more specific. We're going to examine the rise of what is widely recognized as the spiritual movement in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, centered mainly in the English-speaking world of Great Britain and North America, as well as some regions of Europe, and primarily based in Protestant Christianity. Historians looking back on this phenomena often point to 1848 as the key founding date of modern spiritualism. That was the date that the Fox sisters of Hydesville, New York, first claimed to make contact with the spirit world. The family had recently moved into a new home, and they determined it could possibly be haunted. So the sisters embarked on some experiments and according to them, successfully heard back from the other side. They claimed to have asked yes or no questions of the ghosts, and then heard knocks or raps in reply. The sisters rose to fame very quickly, and their rather unique type of call and response activity swept the world by storm. Sure, they were inspired by what people had been doing all over the world for thousands of years, calling out and asking if anyone is there. But the Fox sisters capitalized and profited on it in a way that had never been seen before. Soon the sisters were taking their show on the road and traveling from place to place, greeted by curious townsfolk, skeptical religious leaders, and a macabre Victorian society fascinated by all things to do with mortality. The call and response events, soon called séances, were a hit. The only problem was the Fox sisters were largely exposed as fraudsters in later years. 3 women simply out to make a quick buck and escape from their otherwise dull domestic lives. Some still believe the Fox sisters started off as genuine spiritualists who were able to make legitimate contact with the dead through their early séances. But as time wore on and word of their special abilities spread, they quickly became wrapped up in the show and the constant expectation to perform. In fact, there are some documented events early in their spiritualist journey that reveal audiences were disappointed and downright angry when the sisters failed to produce any spirits. It's easy to see how the pressure must have mounted, and why they started faking their shows in order to stir up interest, entertain their audience, and draw more attendees. Wherever the truth lies with the Fox sisters and their séances, a wider conversation about contacting the dead had begun. It didn't take long for these types of séances to be regularly held in middle and upper class parlours across North America, Britain, and Europe. Coupled with urbanization and a growing intellectual middle class, new philosophical trends exploring mortality, the questioning of religious authority, first-wave feminism, and even the advent of the literary horror genre, spiritualism was uniquely tied to its time and place. Before we go any further, it's important to recognize that spiritualism in the late 19th and early 20th century was considered by most as a religious movement. Its followers were often ardent believers in Protestantism and were simply seeking new and different ways of reaching out to the dead, which they hoped could bring them deeper religious understanding. Spiritualists during this period didn't question the central ideas of the Christian faith. Instead, they saw their work as supporting religion and enhancing their relationship with God. However, many traditional preachers spoke out against the practice and labeled them as anti-Christian, probably because they were feeling threatened by the promise of a new movement, and for good reason. If ordinary people were able to contact the dead, as spiritualism indicated, it could be possible that those same people were able to interpret God's word or message. Understandably, preachers were probably worried that their jobs may become obsolete, and their power would soon be meaningless if spiritualism grew too much. By the early 20th century, spiritualist churches were popping up across the country, with many predictably located in growing city centers where diverse people were coming together and sharing new ideas. The largest concentrations were in British Columbia, Alberta, and southern Ontario, as well as small pockets in the Maritimes. The description of these weekly services sounds quite familiar to anyone familiar with Protestant worship. A mixture of songs, biblical interpretation, and preaching. A quick survey across the country shows that spiritualist churches generally held their services on Sundays, usually in the evenings, to allow attendees to go to their regular church services earlier in the day. They also had social events, lectures, and studies in the evening throughout the week. The ads for spiritualist churches across Canada appeared alongside other denominations in the newspaper. No lurid dramas or mention of séances to be found in their rather dry adverts. Even some of their most unconventional practices were listed with cheery descriptions. An event posting from the Spiritualist Church in Calgary in 1942 talks about a strawberry tea with a clairvoyant Mr. T. Merrifield, where the teacup and crystal readings are the notable highlights. A tea run by the same church in 1933 was described as being prettily decorated with flowers and good luck emblems. During the same period in Windsor, the rather innocuous-sounding Rosebud Club and Sunflower Club met regularly at local community centers and other churches. None of this sounds like a threat to society. What harm can flowery tea clubs do? But as we will learn, there was a growing fear throughout Canada that spiritualists were doing something morally wrong and potentially very dangerous. Most people who study the history of spiritualism tend to turn to Great Britain and the United States, and rightfully so. Those places experienced the biggest explosion of spiritualism in the late 19th century, and then the resurgence of the movement in the 1920s. But in that study, Canada is often completely forgotten, and people either disregard or completely miss the important texts that were published here. Some of the first spiritual churches opened here, and one of the most famous spiritualist believers and notable politicians was from here. So let's zoom in on Canada more closely and consider the brewing controversy in the young northern nation as spiritualism entered the picture in the early 20th century. Spiritualism around the world reached its peak during and immediately following the First World War, and Canada was no exception. Many point to the devastation of the conflict and the desire that people had to reach out to departed loved ones. Spiritualism promised a way to channel and possibly relieve the painful losses associated with the conflict. The social upheaval caused by the war and the decades leading up to it fostered an environment that was more open to beliefs which challenged the status quo. Those changes were apparent in Canada too. Spiritualist societies had been founded here in the late 19th century, mainly in big cities, and flourished amongst intellectuals. These societies, although quite popular for their time, barely registered as a blip on the growing radar of diverse beliefs that were spreading across Canada. But spiritualists were Protestants, and quite often very devoted to Christianity. So what did traditional religious leaders have to say about people who were following a slightly different branch of their faith? Well, quite a bit, actually. During speaking tours across Canada, the subject of spiritualism, and particularly the growing practice of séance, was increasingly raised by fiery preachers intent on instilling fear in the population. In 1903, an alarming letter to the editor of the Hamilton Spectator proclaimed, "I'm convinced that spiritualism is not from God, but belongs to the powers of darkness." The horrifying message from a massive lecture given by Reverend William O'Brien Pardow a few years later was summarized as ghosts as the messengers of Satan, table turning and spirit rapping as the practice jokes of devils, spiritualistic séances as the parlor games of hellhounds. Even as the practice grew and became more widespread, the fear-mongering continued and preachers reminded Christians that evil was always lurking in their midst. In 1920, Reverend Father Frere spoke to a crowd in Montreal and reminded them that anyone who wishes to come into contact with the spiritual world must behave with caution and discretion. The spiritual world has another side, represented by Satan and evil spirits. The more we study the spiritual world, the closer and more real become Satan and the devil and devils generally. A large part of the spiritual world is evil and hostile. The less of contact with such a world, the better. Although plenty of people were urging caution, just as many were curious and willing to try it out, fear-mongering be damned. Since spiritualism, at the time, didn't depart too radically from Judeo-Christian thought, worshippers were eager to see it for themselves and understood spiritualism as an addition to their faith, not a challenge to it. Into this world of parallels between Christianity and spiritualism walks Albert Durant Watson, a physician, poet, and hymn writer. He had a long list of scientific and religious publications, strongly adhering to a firm mortality that characterized medical practice at that time. But that's not what he became most known for. Dr. Watson eventually became known as one of Canada's most famous and controversial spiritualist writers. It seems that Dr. Watson was interested in spiritualism quite early on in his life. He admitted to dabbling in some of the practices, but only insofar as it aligned with his strong Christian faith. Eventually, he became more curious and was convinced that spiritualism was something genuine. He followed the same path of many early followers, convinced that spiritualism was a way that ordinary Christians could become closer to their religion. Dr. Watson joined forces with Louis Benjamin, and the two began holding sensational séances in Watson's Toronto home. Originally a skeptic, Dr. Watson was intrigued in a trance-like way by Benjamin, and eventually came to consider him a type of Jewish mystic that could tap into ancient traditions. Although Dr. Watson admired Benjamin and his array of talents, the doctor possessed one thing the young man didn't have: social connections. Dr. Watson assembled prominent guests in his Toronto parlor, comprised of lawyers, physicians, politicians, and members of elite society. These guests weren't simply interested in the entertainment Benjamin was providing, they were also willing to shell out wads of cash in order to witness and document it. While these spiritual salons were growing increasingly common, the ones held at Dr. Watson's home attracted some of the biggest names and the largest amounts of cash, which must have been especially appealing to Benjamin, a young man yet to find his true calling. The seances were becoming quite standardized by the early 1920s, but every medium did things a bit differently. Benjamin would commonly use a Ouija board to receive communications, but also used other forms of written and spoken communication. He would scribble down the revelations that came from the other side as evidence, passing it on to all who attended. Having a written record of sessions straight from the mediums themselves was quite novel and made Benjamin stand out from his competition. Dr. Watson was also so intrigued by these documented musings that he began collecting the discarded papers after every seance, and eventually published a book called The 12th Plane, a Psychic Revelation. It was billed as a collection of real communications from famous spirits who offered insights and advice to the living. The book was intended to spread the message of spiritualism to the world and convert new followers. Dr. Watson was convinced the text would be a resounding success that would propel him and Benjamin into the spotlight. While some people in Canada were open to the idea and wanted to read his book out of genuine interest, far more lined up to mock the absurdity of his claims. One of his most notable critics was Lucy Maud Montgomery, the famous author of Canada's most beloved book series, Anne of Green Gables. Montgomery was a spiritualist by the time she picked up the book, but found Dr. Watson's account rather laughable. Her review included the remark, "There isn't a single non-famous spirit on Watson's calling list, except his mother. Shakespeare and Plato and Wordsworth and Lincoln, etc., 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 jostle each other for a chance to expound, and all use precisely the same literary style, and a very awful one at that. There doesn't seem to be any grocers or butchers or carpenters on the 12th plane." Her critique was amusing, almost in a tongue-in-cheek kind of way, but others were more scathing and dismissive. Religious leaders were downright angry, fuming that Dr. Watson had used Christian teachings to smooth so many outlandish, evil claims. The book caused a massive sensation, and none of the press coverage was particularly positive. People became more interested in reading its terrible reviews than actually picking up a copy for themselves. The project blew up in Watson's face, and he never recovered. Dr. Watson took a lot of professional heat for pairing up with Benjamin, and it's likely one of the reasons the two split shortly after the book was published. Dr. Watson's belief in Benjamin's genuine power was waning, and he became more and more convinced that the young man was a fraudster. Perhaps he was just bitter, though, as Watson maintained his steadfast belief in the tenets of spiritualism until his death. Still, Dr. Watson was forced to pay for the book's failure with his reputation. His speaking contracts were cancelled, and he was removed from both the religious and the medical circuits. His beloved hymns were excluded from standard Christian canon, and he was simultaneously shunned by other spiritualists, many of whom felt that his book mocked their genuine beliefs. His parlour fell into silence and no longer hosted séances. Elite Toronto society turned to other amusements or other spiritualists. On the other hand, Louis Benjamin's reputation grew as he thrived for a medium for over a decade, holding countless sessions for those who could pay for his services. His fame peaked when he hosted one of the world's most renowned spiritualists, an event that shaped the future of spiritualism in Canada. Who was this famous man? Arguably one of the strongest and most vocal supporters of spiritualism? You'll have to wait for part 2 of our series. Thank you so much for joining us for this episode. If you are interested in our own spiritualist adventure, our Alone in the Dark experiences at Cumberland Village in Ottawa, or Black Creek Village in Toronto, or any of our ghost tours available, including those extra special ones on Valentine's weekend, please visit our website, hauntedwalk.com. There you'll find all the info, as well as our Creepy Curiosities blog, our online experiences, and of course, more episodes of Haunted Talks. We would love to connect with you on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and now Blue Sky, all at Haunted Walk. And if you enjoyed this episode, we hope you will subscribe, rate, and review wherever you listen and recommend it to a friend or two who love all things spooky. Special thanks to our amazing Haunted Talks team, including Michelle Dennis, our outstanding audio editor, and Brittney Buss, who researched and wrote this special series. Until we meet again, knock once if you can hear me, and sweet dreams.